The wind in Redemption, Dakota, was a constant dusty presence, carrying the scent of dry earth and sun-baked timber. It was a town born of stubbornness and little else, a collection of ramshackle saloons and storefronts clinging to the edge of the prairie. At its heart was the sheriff's office, a stone building that looked too solid for the town around it, as if it had been dropped there by mistake. And behind the solid stone was Sheriff Silas Blackwood, a man who had forged his own law from fear and brute force. Today, the wind brought something new, the distinct click-clack of a carriage that hadn't seen a dirt road in its life. The townsfolk, few and weary, paused their meagre work. They squinted against the sun at the approaching vehicle, a symbol of a world far removed from their own. The driver, a skinny man with a nervous twitch, pulled the reins on two fine bay horses, bringing the ornate carriage to a halt in front of the sheriff's office. The door swung open, and out stepped Silas Blackwood himself. He was a towering figure, broad-shouldered and sharp-eyed, with a reputation that preceded him like a thundercloud. He wore a dark, clean suit that seemed out of place in the dusty street, a clear sign of his power. He opened the carriage door with a flourish that was meant to be courtly but came across as a command. And then she appeared. Her name was Elizabeth Stanton, and the whispers had already made her a legend before she ever set a foot in Redemption. She stepped out of the carriage with a grace that seemed impossible for the circumstances. Her dress was a deep emerald, rich silk that caught the light, and a small, delicate bonnet framed a face of porcelain beauty. She held herself straight and tall, a stark contrast to the slouched, dirt-covered figures of the town. She didn't look at the crowd gathering. Her eyes, the color of a stormy sea, were fixed on the sheriff, her expression unreadable. A wave of silence fell over Redemption. The clinking of a blacksmith's hammer stopped. The saloon door creaked, but no one entered. All eyes were on Elizabeth. She was everything the rumors had promised and more, a lady of high society from St. Louis, a woman who had somehow agreed to marry the man who held Redemption in an iron fist. The fear she inspired was immediate, a cold, sharp feeling that was different from the weary resignation they felt for Blackwood. With him, it was a physical dread. With her, it was a sense of being judged and found wanting. Silas Blackwood, for his part, seemed to swell with pride. "Redemption," he announced, his voice a low rumble. "I'd like you to meet my future wife, Elizabeth." A few hesitant claps followed, dying out quickly under Elizabeth's cold stare. She swept a gaze over the assembled people, a glance that seemed to take in every frayed cuff, every dirt-smudged face, and dismiss it. The women pulled their children closer, their faces etched with a mix of awe and resentment. The men shifted their weight, a nervous energy in the air. Among them was Abigail, a girl of 17 with a spirit as untamed as her thick brown hair. Unlike the others, she watched Elizabeth with a fierce curiosity. She wasn't afraid. She was a survivor, having learned to fend for herself after her parents died. She lived in a small, weathered cabin on the outskirts of town, caring for the ailing father of a cowboy named Caleb. This land was the sole thing Caleb had left, and it was the very thing Sheriff Blackwood had been eyeing for months. Abigail saw something in Elizabeth's eyes that the others missed, a flicker of fear, a momentary break in the cold facade. It was gone in an instant, replaced by that imperious, unreadable mask. But Abigail had seen it. She had seen the raw fear of a trapped animal. The sheriff led Elizabeth into his office, a clear dismissal to the crowd. The door closed behind them with a heavy thud, and the town slowly, tentatively, came back to life. But the air was different now. A new power had arrived, a silent, chilling force that felt more dangerous than the sheriff's overt cruelty. Elizabeth Stanton was no simple bride. She was a queen in a kingdom of dust, and the town of Redemption had just been placed under her cold, silent rule. Abigail walked toward the saloon, her worn boots kicking up dust. Inside, the noise was muted. The men sat hunched over their drinks, talking in hushed tones about the new woman. "She looked like she'd turn a man to stone," one old-timer muttered, shaking his head. "I hear she's got a fortune in St. Louis," another whispered. "Why would a woman like that come here?" "For Blackwood's money, of course. He's got more than anyone in this county." Abigail heard them, but didn't listen. She was thinking of that fleeting moment in Elizabeth's eyes. It was a contradiction. A woman who held such power and commanded such fear shouldn't have a flicker of terror in her gaze. It was a puzzle, and Abigail, who had spent her life figuring out how to survive, was intrigued. She didn't know it yet, but that small flicker of fear was the thread that would eventually unravel the sheriff's dark hold on redemption. And she, a simple orphan girl, would be the one to pull it. The days that followed Elizabeth Stanton's arrival were marked by a suffocating tension. The town of Redemption walked on eggshells. Women pulled their wash off the lines if they saw her carriage coming. Men tipped their hats lower, averting their eyes as she passed. The sheriff seemed to enjoy the effect she had on them. It was a new form of power, a silent extension of his own. Elizabeth, meanwhile, seemed to exist in a world of her own, the elegant silks of her dresses, a sharp, colourful contrast to the drab browns and greys of the town. She didn't speak to anyone, rarely left the sheriff's stone office, and when she did, her face was a mask of cold indifference. Abigail, however, couldn't shake the image of Elizabeth's eyes. It was a gnawing curiosity, a small seed of empathy that had taken root in her. She knew what it was to feel trapped. She felt it every day, caring for old Mr. Abernathy and his sprawling, dusty ranch, which Silas Blackwood was determined to take. Caleb, Mr. Abernathy's son, was far away, and the old man was too sick to fight. Blackwood had been applying pressure, subtly at first, then with increasing aggression. Abigail was the only thing standing between him and the land. One sweltering afternoon, Abigail was on her way to the general store to buy supplies for Mr. Abernathy. The air was thick and heavy, the kind of heat that made a man's temper short. As she passed the sheriff's office, she saw something she'd never expected. Elizabeth Stanton was on the porch, a pale hand pressed to her forehead. Her face, usually so composed, was strained and clammy. She swayed on her feet, the emerald green of her dress a vivid splash against the grey stone. A moment later she stumbled, a low groan escaping her lips. She would have fallen if not for the railing she clutched. The carriage was gone, and there was no one else around. The sheriff was likely inside, away from the midday sun. Abigail's instincts, honed by years of caring for the sick and the weak, took over. She rushed to the porch. "Ma'am," she said, her voice soft but clear. "Are you all right?" Elizabeth's head shot up. Her eyes, filled with a sudden panic, met Abigail's. The mask was gone. For a fleeting second, the vulnerability from that first day was back, magnified by her obvious distress. But then, just as quickly, the wall went back up. Her face hardened, and her lips thinned into a line. "I do not require your assistance," Elizabeth said, her voice a frosty whisper, a stark contrast to the stifling heat. She straightened her posture, a visible effort. "Leave me be." Abigail, however, wasn't leaving. She saw the sweat on Elizabeth's brow and the tremor in her hand. "You look like you're about to faint. You need some water, ma'am. Let me get you something." "I said, I do not need your help," Elizabeth repeated louder this time. Her tone was sharp, filled with a cutting disdain that stung. "Do you not understand plain English? Get away from me, you common girl." The words hit Abigail like a slap, but she held her ground. Her face, however, betrayed her feelings. A mixture of hurt and defiance flashed in her eyes. "I was just trying to help," she said, her own voice losing its softness. "I am perfectly capable of caring for myself." Elizabeth spat, her breath coming in short, quick gasps. She pushed herself away from the railing, taking a wobbly step. "I am not one of your charity cases." A sudden sound from inside the sheriff's office made both of them freeze. The sound of heavy footsteps. Elizabeth's face blanched. She looked at Abigail, then back at the door, a frantic look in her eyes. "Go!" she hissed, a note of desperation in her voice. "Now!" Abigail, confused but sensing the real fear in the woman now, stepped back. She saw the door handle turn. The door opened just enough for her to catch a glimpse of the sheriff's shadow. Elizabeth took a shaky breath, pulled her shoulders back, and a smile that didn't reach her eyes appeared on her face. "Thank you for your concern, little one," she said, her voice suddenly sweet, almost condescending. "But I assure you, I am quite well." The door opened fully. Silas Blackwood stood there, his eyes sweeping over the two of them. "What's all this, Elizabeth?" he asked, his voice a low growl. "Trouble with the help?" "No, my dear," Elizabeth said, her hand reaching to touch his arm, the picture of a doting fiancé. This kind girl was simply making sure I was all right. I was just thanking her." Blackwood's gaze settled on Abigail. He knew her. He knew her connection to the Abernathy land. A slow, predatory smile spread across his face. "Well now, if it isn't the Abernathy girl," he said, his tone dripping with menace. "You should be grateful, Elizabeth. Most folks in this town are too scared to look you in the eye." Elizabeth laughed, a sound as brittle as glass. "I can't imagine why, Silas. I am simply a lady. Now, I do believe I'm feeling a bit tired. Would you mind taking me inside?" Blackwood's gaze lingered on Abigail for a moment longer, a silent threat in his eyes, before he turned and escorted Elizabeth inside. The door closed. Abigail was left on the dusty street, the sting of Elizabeth's words still fresh. The kindness she had offered had been thrown back in her face. The brief moment of empathy was gone, replaced by a cold knot of anger. She didn't understand the complex dance she had just witnessed, but one thing was clear: the sheriff's bride was a cruel woman. Little did she know that interaction had changed everything. Elizabeth's heart was a fortress, but Abigail's simple act of kindness, however rebuffed, had left a crack, and that crack was about to get much, much bigger. Redemption had a way of bringing out the worst in people. The heat and the dust wore on tempers, and the law, under Sheriff Blackwood, was less about justice and more about who had the most to lose. Blackwood's latest target was the Abernathy land, a prime piece of property with good grazing and a spring-fed creek. He had wanted it for months, and now, with old Mr. Abernathy too sick to fight, he was getting impatient. Abigail, as the caretaker, was the only thing standing in his way. She had a legal document from Caleb, giving her temporary power of attorney. She'd kept it hidden, knowing that if Blackwood found out, he would surely find a way to invalidate it. He was a master of using the law against the lawless. The morning after her failed attempt to help Elizabeth, Abigail was out back of the Abernathy cabin, mending a fence. She felt a deep resentment toward the sheriff's bride. The sting of Elizabeth's words still lingered, a hot, angry burn on her pride. She had tried to be kind, and in return she was called a common girl. The phrase echoed in her mind. A cloud of dust on the horizon announced a rider. As it drew closer, she saw it was Silas Blackwood, alone on his horse, his face set in a grim expression. Abigail's heart thumped a nervous rhythm against her ribs. She straightened, her hands going to her hips. Blackwood dismounted, his boots crunching on the dry grass. He didn't bother with a greeting. "Abernathy's time is running out, girl," he said, his voice flat and cold. "The county needs that land. I'm prepared to make you an offer." "The land isn't mine to sell, Sheriff," Abigail replied, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "It belongs to Caleb. He'll be back one day. Caleb Abernathy is a long way off. He's probably dead in some mining camp in Colorado." Blackwood sneered. "And even if he ain't, I have papers here from the county court. Abernathy's property taxes are 3 months overdue. The county is foreclosing." Abigail's stomach dropped. She knew the taxes were past due, but she had sent Caleb's last earnings to pay them. The money should have arrived. A cold dread settled over her. Blackwood was lying. "I sent the money," she insisted. "It should have been paid." Blackwood laughed, a harsh, humourless sound. He pulled a thick document from his saddlebag. "These papers say otherwise. The county sent a notice, and when it went unpaid, a notice of foreclosure. The land is mine legally and by the law of the land." Abigail knew something was wrong. She had seen the man she had entrusted with the money, a travelling merchant who passed through redemption, and he swore he'd deliver it. Blackwood had to have intercepted it. He was a master of such schemes, using his power and influence to manipulate the weak. "You can't do this," Abigail said, her voice rising with a frantic edge. "You're lying. I sent the money." "Lying is a serious accusation, girl," Blackwood said, his eyes narrowing. "And accusing a man of the law of corruption, that's a crime." He took a menacing step toward her. "I'll give you until tomorrow morning to clear out, and don't bother telling anyone. Nobody's going to believe a common girl like you over the sheriff." He turned and got back on his horse, leaving Abigail standing in the dust, the papers in his hand, a symbol of his corrupt power. Abigail stood there for a long time, watching the sheriff's dust cloud disappear. Her rage and helplessness were a potent mix. He had taken her last hope, her last defense. He had used the law to steal the last piece of a family that had been kind to her, a family that had taken her in. She thought of old Mr. Abernathy, lying in his bed, too weak to know what was happening, and the thought fueled her anger. She wouldn't just sit by. She wouldn't let him do this. But what could she do? She was alone, with no one to stand up for her. The town was terrified of Blackwood, and nobody would dare cross him for an orphan girl. That evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Abigail walked toward town. She needed to tell someone, anyone. She would go to the general store, to the saloon. She would tell every man and woman what the sheriff was doing. Even if they were scared, maybe one of them would have a conscience. She passed the sheriff's office, and a thought struck her. She saw Elizabeth Stanton through a window, sitting alone in a dimly lit room, staring into a blank space. A pang of something close to pity, but more like a cold understanding, went through Abigail. That woman was Blackwood's prisoner just as much as anyone in redemption, perhaps even more. The shame and pain from their encounter the day before still burned, but the greater injustice she was now facing eclipsed it. She had nothing to lose. The town wouldn't help her, so she might as well try something foolish, something desperate. She walked up to the sheriff's porch, her heart pounding. She raised a trembling hand and knocked on the door. It was a crazy idea, a complete act of desperation. But she had to try. Elizabeth Stanton, the sheriff's bride who had publicly humiliated her, was her last, impossible hope. The door opened. It wasn't the sheriff. It was Elizabeth. Elizabeth's face, usually a study in controlled emotion, registered genuine surprise. She held a book in her hand, her finger still marking a page. Her eyes, which had held such disdain just the day before, now held a flicker of something she couldn't hide. She had seen Abigail outside, watched her walk past the window, and then, with a shocking display of courage, approached the door. "What do you want?" Elizabeth asked, her voice low, a guarded whisper. She glanced nervously back into the house. I need to speak to you," Abigail said, her breath coming in short, quick bursts. The words tumbled out, fueled by a mix of fear and desperation. "It's about the sheriff. He's taking the Abernathy's land." Elizabeth's mask fell back into place. "And what does that have to do with me?" she said, the coldness returning. "This is not my concern." She made to close the door. "He's using a fake foreclosure," Abigail blurted out, sticking her foot in the way. "I sent the money for the taxes. He must have intercepted it. He's lying, and there's nothing I can do." Her voice cracked with the weight of her helplessness. "He says the land is his by law, but it's a lie. A lie." Elizabeth's expression didn't change, but her eyes, those stormy, distant eyes, were watching Abigail intently now. She wasn't looking at a common girl anymore. She was looking at a human being in pain. "He's doing this because he knows Mr. Abernathy is sick, And he knows his son Caleb is far away. He's using the law to take what isn't his. The words came out in a rush, a raw, unfiltered plea. You're with him. You can talk to him. You can make him stop. A small, bitter smile touched Elizabeth's lips. You think I have any influence over Silas Blackwood? You've seen the kind of man he is. He doesn't listen to anyone. Abigail looked at the ground, a wave of despair washing over her. She knew it was a foolish hope. The woman had been cruel to her, arrogant and dismissive. Why would she help now? I'm sorry, Abigail muttered. I shouldn't have come. I don't know who else to turn to. She pulled her foot back, ready to retreat, to face the inevitable alone. But the door didn't close. Elizabeth looked at her, her face a canvas of conflicting emotions. Abigail's vulnerability had struck a chord. It was a familiar feeling, the feeling of being cornered, of having no one to turn to. It was the very reason she was in redemption. "Wait," Elizabeth said, her voice barely a whisper. She looked over her shoulder again, then stepped back, pulling the door open wider. "Come in," quickly. Abigail hesitated, her mind racing. This was a trap, it had to be. But what was the alternative? She stepped inside, the door closing with a quiet click behind her. The room was dark, the curtains drawn. It smelled of old wood and lavender. Elizabeth led her into the parlor, a room furnished with expensive furniture that looked out of place in the rustic building. She didn't offer a seat. She just stood there, staring at Abigail, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "What you said about the law, how do you know he intercepted the money?" Elizabeth asked, her voice low and tense. Abigail explained everything, from giving the money to the traveling merchant to the letter she had received from Caleb confirming the transfer. "He knows I have nothing," she said, her voice filled with a desperate conviction. "He knows I have no one to fight for me." Elizabeth turned and walked to the window, pulling the curtain back slightly. Her silhouette was framed against the fading light. "You're not the first person he's done this to," she said, her voice distant, a memory in her tone. "You know?" Abigail asked, her eyes wide with surprise. "I know a lot about Silas Blackwood," Elizabeth said, a bitter edge to her voice. She turned to face Abigail, her eyes now devoid of the previous coldness. "I saw you yesterday. You came to me when I was ill. You offered me water. I was not myself. I'm sorry for what I said. I was a fool." Abigail was stunned. The apology was unexpected, sincere, and it changed everything. She saw the woman now, not the cold, cruel mask, but the person underneath. A woman trapped in her own way, perhaps more so than Abigail. "Why?" Abigail asked, the question hanging in the air between them. "Why did you act that way?" Elizabeth's expression hardened, but it wasn't from cruelty this time. It was from pain. "That is not your concern. But what you are going through, I can help you. I can stop him." Abigail's jaw dropped. "How?" "I am his fiancée," Elizabeth said, a cold determination in her voice, "and he is a very proud man. He wants this marriage to be a symbol of his power and his respectability. He will not risk a scandal. I know his weaknesses, Abigail. I know his secrets. I will use them. I will use everything I have against him." It was a terrifying proposal. Elizabeth was suggesting she would defy the most feared man in the county for a girl she had met only twice. "Why are you doing this?" Abigail asked, a genuine question. "Why help me?" Elizabeth's eyes met hers. "Because you are the mirror of the person I once was," she said, a flicker of pain in her gaze. "A person he tried to break, a person he thought he had broken. And because I can't stand to see another good soul tarnished by his cruelty." Abigail looked at her, and in that moment the impossible alliance was born. The sheriff's proud bride and the town's humble orphan girl, united by a common enemy and a shared secret. "So, what do we do?" Abigail asked, her voice filled with a newfound hope. Elizabeth's lips formed a determined line. "We fight fire with fire," she said, "but we do it my way. First, you will get me the evidence. We will find out who the merchant was. We will find out where the money was sent. And then we will shame him before the whole town." Abigail felt a rush of adrenaline. She was no longer a helpless girl. She had a powerful, albeit strange, ally. And for the first time in a long time, she felt a glimmer of hope. The unlikely alliance between Elizabeth and Abigail was a delicate thing, built on a single, shared moment of honesty. For the next few days, their contact was secretive. Abigail would approach the sheriff's office on the pretense of errands, and Elizabeth would meet her on the porch, a quick exchange of whispered words before retreating inside. The town noticed nothing out of the ordinary. They saw only a fleeting interaction between the sheriff's haughty bride and the humble Abernathy girl, and they assumed Elizabeth was simply giving her a task. Elizabeth, however, was using her time inside the sheriff's office to her advantage. She had a keen intellect and a sharp eye for detail. While Silas was out on his rounds, or in the saloon, she would meticulously search his office. She was looking for a paper trail, anything that could connect him to the intercepted tax money. Her search was a tense, thrilling affair. She had to be quick, quiet, and thorough. She found old ledgers, notes, and a few threatening letters he had sent to other landowners. The evidence of his corruption was everywhere, a testament to his arrogance. But there was nothing about the Abernathy's tax payment. The merchant's name wasn't in any of his records. Silas Blackwood was too smart to leave a clear trail. Meanwhile, Abigail was doing her part. She went back to the old Abernathy cabin, searching for any scrap of information. She found a faded receipt from the merchant, a name scrawled on the back, T. Jenkins. He was a traveling goods salesman who frequented the smaller, forgotten towns. Abigail recalled his route, a dusty loop that would bring him back to redemption in a few weeks. The only problem was they didn't have a few weeks. Blackwood had given her until tomorrow. She brought the news to Elizabeth. "His name is T. Jenkins," she whispered, handing her the tattered piece of paper. "He's on the road. We can't wait for him to come back. Silas will have the land by tomorrow." Elizabeth's face, etched with a new kind of worry, crumpled the paper in her hand. "This isn't enough," she said, her voice laced with frustration. "We need something more. We need proof, not just a name, something that connects him to Silas." "Maybe there's another way," Abigail suggested, her mind racing. "The bank. The money for the taxes. It was in a bank draft. If Silas intercepted it, he must have cashed it." Elizabeth's eyes lit up. "The bank," she repeated, the word a sudden point of light in the darkness. "The town's bank is run by his brother-in-law, a man named Bartholomew. He's a crooked, spineless little man who would do anything for Silas, but the transaction would have to be recorded. The plan was audacious, but it was their only hope. Abigail would have to get inside the bank and find the ledger. It would be a dangerous task. Bartholomew was as loyal to Silas as a dog to its master. That night, under the cover of a moonless sky, Abigail slipped into town. The bank was a small building next to the general store. The back door was usually left unlocked, a sign of the town's naive trust in a place that held their money. Abigail crept to the back, her heart pounding. The door creaked open, and she slipped inside. The air was cool and smelled of paper and ink. The office was dark, and the only light came from the faint glow of the stars through the dusty window. She found the ledger on a desk, a heavy book bound in leather. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The pages were filled with meticulous looping script. She flipped through the dates, her eyes scanning for T. Jenkins' name. She didn't find it, but she found something else. An entry from 2 weeks prior, a large withdrawal from a savings account signed Silas Blackwood. Below it, a note, "Payment to T. Jenkins for services rendered." The amount was exactly the sum of the Abernathy's taxes. Abigail's breath caught in her throat. It was there, the proof, a direct link between Blackwood and the merchant. He hadn't just intercepted the money, he had paid the merchant himself, likely to silence him or pay him off for his cooperation. The evidence was irrefutable. She copied the entry onto a small piece of paper, her fingers flying in the dark. Just as she finished, she heard footsteps. Her blood ran cold. She slammed the book shut, her heart a frantic drumbeat against her ribs. She was trapped. She could hear the lock of the front door turning. Bartholomew was coming in. She scrambled under the desk, her knees knocking together. The door opened and a single lantern was lit. Bartholomew, a portly man with a nervous demeanor, walked in. He mumbled to himself as he fumbled with some papers on his desk. He was leaving something, a deposit slip he had forgotten to put away. Abigail held her breath, her small body pressed against the cold wood. He was so close, she could smell the stale beer on his breath. He was taking his time. He was a creature of habit, and tonight his habit was to do everything slowly. He put the paper away, blew out the lantern, and walked out, locking the door behind him. Abigail waited in the dark for what felt like an eternity before she dared to move. She crawled out from under the desk, her body sore and stiff. She crept out the back door and ran, not stopping until she reached her cabin. She was safe, and she had the evidence. The next morning, Abigail met Elizabeth behind the general store. She showed her the scrap of paper. Elizabeth's eyes widened as she read the entry. A slow, triumphant smile spread across her face. "He's a fool," Elizabeth said, her voice filled with a cold satisfaction. "He thinks he's so clever, but he's careless. He left a trail." "What do we do now?" Abigail asked, the thrill of their small victory giving her courage. "Now," Elizabeth said, her eyes gleaming with a newfound purpose, "we shame him." The sun was high and unforgiving, baking the dust of redemption into a fine, powdery haze. The day was no different from any other, except for the simmering tension in the air. The townsfolk had gathered in front of the sheriff's office, summoned by a public notice on the saloon door. The notice, posted by Sheriff Blackwood himself, was short and to the point. The Abernathy land was being legally seized by the county for delinquent taxes. A public announcement would be made at noon. Abigail stood at the edge of the crowd, her heart a frantic drum. She was alone, her only connection to Elizabeth a single, knowing glance they had exchanged moments before. She saw Elizabeth standing on the porch of the sheriff's office, a vision in pale blue silk, her face a serene mask. She stood beside Silas Blackwood, who was preening for the crowd, his chest puffed out like a proud rooster. "People of redemption," oh, Blackwood boomed, his voice a powerful roar that echoed in the quiet street. "I am here today to announce that the law has been upheld. The Abernathy land has been foreclosed upon. The deed is now in my possession to be used for the good of the county." A few people muttered, but no one dared to speak up. The fear of Blackwood was too deep. Abigail felt her hope dwindle. Elizabeth had a plan, but what could she possibly do? Blackwood had the law on his side, or at least his version of it. Just as Blackwood was about to continue, Elizabeth took a step forward. "Silas," she said, her voice clear and carrying, a stark contrast to his booming tone. "My dear, I must confess, I find this rather distasteful." Blackwood's smile froze. He looked at her, a look of warning in his eyes. "Elizabeth, this is not the time for your sensibilities." "On the contrary, my love," Elizabeth said, her voice gaining a strength that made Abigail's jaw drop. "It is the perfect time. I have made a shocking discovery. It seems the Abernathy family is not in debt after all." A collective gasp went through the crowd. Blackwood's face turned a dangerous shade of red. "What in the devil are you talking about?" he hissed, his voice low and full of venom. "I am talking about the truth, my dear," Elizabeth said, her smile as cold as a winter morning. She held up the crumpled piece of paper Abigail had given her. "I was doing some cleaning in your office, as a good future wife should, and I found this." She unfolded the paper, holding it for the crowd to see. It was the scrap of paper with the bank entry. "This is a record from your brother-in-law's bank. It shows a payment made to a Mr. T. Jenkins for the exact amount of the Abernathy's taxes, and it is signed by you, Silas." The silence that followed was deafening. The crowd looked from Elizabeth to Blackwood, their faces a mix of confusion and disbelief. "This is a lie! A forgery!" Blackwood roared, his mask of a respectable man cracking. He lunged for the paper, but Elizabeth was too quick. She stepped back, her hand held high. "Is it?" she said, her voice steady and full of accusation. "Why would you, the honest sheriff of redemption, pay off the tax collector? Why would you sign your own name to such a document? Unless, of course, you had intercepted the money yourself." Blackwood was seething. He turned to the crowd, his eyes wild with a mixture of rage and panic. "This woman is mad. She has no idea what she's talking about. This is a plot by that little Abernathy girl to save her land. She's bewitched Elizabeth." Elizabeth laughed, a short, sharp, and utterly humiliating sound. "Bewitched? Silas, don't be absurd. The only one under a spell here is you, believing you could get away with stealing a dying man's land for your own gain. The only witch here, my dear, is your greed." The crowd murmured. The whispers grew louder. They had always suspected Blackwood was a thief, but they had never had proof. And now the proof was being laid out for them by the woman he was about to marry, a woman he had brought to town as a symbol of his power. "I found this in your own personal safe," Elizabeth continued, her voice gaining momentum. "You keep it as a reminder of all the people you've wronged, do you not? A testament to your power? How pathetic." She didn't stop there. She went on, her voice cutting through the air like a knife. She spoke of the Abernathy land, of the young girl, Abigail, who had risked everything to save it. She spoke of Blackwood's ruthlessness and his contempt for the law he was meant to uphold. Her words were sharp, intelligent, and laced with a deep personal venom that made the crowd realize this wasn't just about land. This was a private war being fought in public. Blackwood, stripped of his authority and exposed to the humiliation he so enjoyed inflicting on others, was a wreck. He was a man of brute force, not of words. He couldn't fight her. He could only stand there, his face a mask of scarlet fury, as his beautiful bride shamed him before the whole town. Finally, Elizabeth turned to the crowd, her face a picture of serene disgust. "I am sorry for the embarrassment this has caused, but I cannot in good conscience marry a man who would steal from a sick man and a brave girl. I am returning the deed to the Abernathy family, and I am leaving redemption and Silas Blackwood as of this very moment." With that, she turned and walked into the sheriff's office, leaving a bewildered, enraged Silas Blackwood on the porch, a broken man in the eyes of his town. The crowd was a storm of whispers and gasps. Abigail, standing on the edge, felt a mix of exhilaration and terror. Elizabeth had done it. She had shamed him, but at what cost? She had just exposed herself as a traitor, and Blackwood was not a man to forgive such a thing. The humiliation, however, was just the beginning. The real conflict, the true battle for redemption, was just about to start. The silence that followed Elizabeth's dramatic exit was a heavy blanket, a palpable shock that had stunned the town of redemption. Silas Blackwood stood on the porch, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. The townsfolk, finally seeing the man they feared laid bare and humiliated, began to disperse, a nervous energy propelling them back to their homes and businesses. No one wanted to be in the sheriff's line of sight when his rage finally erupted. He was a man who ruled with his reputation, and in a single scathing speech, Elizabeth had shattered it. His eyes scanned the street, and they landed on Abigail. She was a small, defiant figure, a living testament to his defeat, the source of his public shame. His fury, which had been boiling, now had a single, specific target. "You!" he roared, pointing a trembling finger at her. "You little snake! You put her up to this!" Abigail's heart leaped into her throat. She didn't hesitate. She turned and ran, the dust kicking up around her feet. She knew better than to stand and face him. Blackwood was not a man for rational conversation. He was an animal of vengeance. "Get her!" Blackwood bellowed at his two deputies, who were just now emerging from the saloon, bewildered by the spectacle. "I want her, now!" Abigail ran, her worn boots pounding on the hard earth. She didn't have a plan, just an instinct to survive. She veered away from the main road, heading toward the cluster of buildings on the edge of town. She heard the shouts behind her, the heavy thud of the deputies' boots. They were faster, bigger, and well-armed. She was a rabbit, and they were the hounds. She ducked into the narrow alleyway between the general store and the livery. The air was thick with the smell of horse manure and hay. The sounds of the town faded behind her, replaced by the relentless footfalls of her pursuers. She scrambled over an old wooden cart, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She had to get to the Abernathy cabin. It was her only sanctuary. But the deputies were closing in. She heard one of them shout, "She's in here! Don't let her get away!" Just as she was about to emerge from the other side of the alley, a hand clamped over her mouth and an arm wrapped around her waist, pulling her back into the shadows. Abigail stifled a scream. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a drumbeat of pure terror. "Quiet," a familiar voice whispered. "It's me." It was Elizabeth. She was dressed in a dark, simple riding habit, her expensive silk dress and bonnet gone. She held a small satchel in her hand. Her face was smudged with dirt, and her eyes, though still intense, held a fierce, desperate glint. She had changed her appearance to avoid being a recognizable target. "Come," Elizabeth said, her grip on Abigail's arm firm. "We don't have time." She led Abigail to a small, hidden stable behind the livery. Inside, a single horse was waiting, a sturdy bay mare. Elizabeth had planned this all out. She had arranged for the horse, had a change of clothes ready, and had a satchel packed with food and water. She had not only shamed the sheriff, but she had also prepared for his retaliation. "Get on," Elizabeth commanded. "We ride." Abigail, too shocked to question her, hoisted herself onto the horse's back. Elizabeth leaped on behind her, taking the reins. "Hold on tight," she said, her voice a low, determined murmur. They burst out of the stable, the horses' hooves thundering on the hard-packed earth. They rode out of town and toward the Abernathy land. The deputies, who had been searching the alleys, emerged just in time to see them disappear over the horizon. Blackwood, seeing his quarry escaping, was fit to burst. He grabbed a horse and took off after them, a lone rider of furious vengeance. The wind whipped past Abigail's face, stinging her eyes. She held on to Elizabeth's waist, feeling the woman's strength and determination. The ride was a whirlwind of motion, a blur of scrub brush and rocky terrain. Elizabeth was an expert horsewoman, a skill Abigail would not have expected from the refined lady of St. Louis. She held the reins with a practiced hand, guiding the horse with an effortless grace. "We're going to my cabin!" Abigail shouted over the wind. "It's the only safe place I know." "No," Elizabeth said, her voice firm. "He will assume you're going there. He'll be there waiting for us. We go to a safe house I arranged." Abigail's mind reeled. A safe house? Elizabeth had planned this whole escape. She had foreseen everything. She was more than just a scorned bride. She was a strategist, a survivor, and for the first time, Abigail felt a glimmer of genuine trust in her. They rode for hours, the sun now a searing disk in the sky. They didn't stop until they reached a small, remote shack nestled in a small canyon, hidden from the main road. Elizabeth dismounted, her legs shaky, but her resolve unwavering. She helped Abigail down. They were safe for now, but they had just made an enemy of the most powerful man in the county. The chase had just begun, and the stakes were higher than ever. Inside the small, dusty safe house, the air was thick with tension and the relief of a temporary escape. Elizabeth lit a small lantern, its soft glow illuminating the bare room. It was a simple place, a cot, a small table, a few shelves with canned goods. Elizabeth had paid a trapper she knew to keep it stocked. She moved with a purpose, a woman now fully in her element, far from the silks and polite society of St. Louis. Abigail sank onto the cot, her body a trembling mix of adrenaline and exhaustion. She watched Elizabeth, mesmerized by the transformation. The cold, refined lady of a few days ago was gone, replaced by a resourceful, determined woman. "You knew he'd come after me," Abigail said, her voice barely a whisper. "You planned all this." Elizabeth turned, her face illuminated by the lantern light. "Of course I did. I know Silas Blackwood. Humiliation is his greatest weakness. He will not rest until he's found you. You are the symbol of his shame, and I am his betrayer. He won't forgive either of us." "But why did you do it?" Abigail asked, the question that had been burning inside her since the public square. "You didn't have to help me. You could have just left." Elizabeth's expression softened, a veil of sadness passing over her features. She sat on a small stool across from Abigail, her hands clasped in her lap. "My name is Elizabeth Stanton, but that wasn't always my name." She took a deep breath, and in the quiet of the small cabin, she began to tell her story. "I was raised in St. Louis, a life of privilege and parties. My father was a wealthy banker, and he had a business partner, a man he trusted implicitly, a man named Thomas Thorne. He was charming and handsome, and he swept me off my feet. I fell in love. I was young and naive. I didn't see the darkness in him. My father, however, did. He discovered that Thomas was swindling clients, using his position to line his own pockets. When my father confronted him, Thomas, he killed him." Abigail gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "He tried to make it look like a suicide," Elizabeth continued, her voice flat, emotionless, as if she had told this story 1,000 times to herself. "But I knew the truth. I found proof, a ledger he kept, just like the one you found. I tried to go to the police, but Thomas had friends in high places. He had bought them, just like Silas has bought the law here. They refused to listen to me. They told me I was hysterical, that I was grieving. Thomas threatened me, told me he would ruin my family name and my life if I didn't keep quiet." "So you fled?" Abigail asked. "I tried," Elizabeth said, a bitter smile on her lips, "but Thomas's power was too great. He had informants everywhere. He hunted me. I was a target. And then I met Silas Blackwood. He came to St. Louis on a business trip, and he saw me. He saw my desperation. He offered me a deal. He said he could protect me, that he had a network of his own. All I had to do was marry him. He promised me safety, a new life, a new name." "He lied," Abigail said, the realization dawning on her. "He lied," Elizabeth confirmed, her voice filled with a cold rage. "He didn't offer me protection. He offered me a cage. He held my past over my head, telling me that if I ever tried to run, he would find me and expose me. He said he would tell everyone that I was a fugitive, and he would send word to Thomas that I was alive. He controlled me. He controlled everything. He brought me here, to a dusty, forgotten town, far from the world I knew, where he could keep me in a gilded cage and parade me around as a symbol of his wealth and power. And the way you acted, that coldness, it was a defense," Abigail said, finally understanding. "You were just trying to survive." "Yes," Elizabeth said, her eyes meeting Abigail's. "It was the only way I knew how. I was a prisoner, Abigail. And I was convinced that I had to live by his rules or perish, until you came along. You, a simple girl with nothing to lose, stood up to him. You were not afraid to ask for help, to admit your vulnerability. And in that moment, I saw a courage I thought I had lost. You were a mirror to the person I used to be, the one who wasn't afraid to fight, and I realized I could fight again. I had nothing left to lose either. You see, the only thing he had on me was my past. And by exposing his own corruption, I have just freed myself from my own shackles. I have nothing left to hide." The confession hung in the air, a profound and heavy thing. Abigail looked at Elizabeth, no longer seeing a cold, distant woman, but a human being who had been through a harrowing ordeal, a woman who, like herself, had been preyed upon and abused by a powerful man. "So now what?" Abigail asked. He'll be coming for us. Elizabeth's eyes narrowed. He'll be coming for me, she corrected. You are just a pawn in his mind. He wants me, the one who publicly humiliated him, the one who exposed his darkest secret. She looked at Abigail with a newfound sense of purpose. But he doesn't know what you and I are capable of. He thinks he's a king in his castle. We'll show him what happens when his queen decides to burn it all down. The sun was a fiery orange disk on the horizon when Silas Blackwood arrived at the Abernathy cabin. He was alone, his fury a tangible presence in the dusty air. He dismounted his horse and kicked the door open with a boot. The cabin was silent, empty. A quick search revealed no sign of Abigail. He scoured the land, his eyes burning with a desperate rage. He had been outsmarted, humiliated by his own woman, and now outmaneuvered by a mere orphan girl. The taste of defeat was bitter. He had to find them. He had to make them pay. He would find them and use them as a lesson to the entire town of Redemption. No one defied Sheriff Blackwood. Meanwhile, back at the safe house, Elizabeth and Abigail were making their own plans. They had spent the night talking, sharing their stories, and building a trust that had seemed impossible just a few days ago. Abigail had explained her relationship with old Mr. Abernathy, a man who had been a father to her, and the promise she had made to protect his land. Elizabeth had shared the details of her life in St. Louis, the betrayal, and her long, hard road that had led her to redemption. There must be someone in town who isn't afraid of him, Abigail mused, pacing the small room. Someone with a conscience. He can't have broken everyone. Elizabeth shook her head. He's been here a long time, Abigail. He has a way of finding a man's weakness and exploiting it. A family to protect, a debt, a secret they don't want the world to know. He's a master of manipulation. But not everyone is a coward, Abigail insisted. What about a man who has nothing to lose? No family, no land to be taken. Elizabeth's mind raced. She had spent weeks observing the town from the sheriff's house, and she knew the people better than she had let on. She thought of the general store owner, a timid man, the blacksmith, a strong man but with a large, vulnerable family, the saloon owner, loyal only to money. Then a face came to mind. An old prospector who lived in the hills, coming down to town only for supplies, a man named Old Man Davies. He was a cantankerous old hermit, with a beard that hung to his chest and eyes that held a keen, intelligent light. He had no family, no land, and no fear. He had spent his life fighting for every ounce of gold he could find. He wasn't scared of Blackwood. He was simply indifferent. "There's one man," Elizabeth said, "Old Man Davies. He lives in a cave in the hills. He's not part of the town. He's not beholden to anyone. He's a wild card. But he has a reputation for being difficult. Difficult is better than cowardly," Abigail said, a spark of hope in her eyes. "We need his help. He can be our witness." The next morning, under the cover of the pre-dawn darkness, they left the safe house and headed for the hills. The terrain was rough and unforgiving, but Elizabeth was a surprisingly sure-footed guide. They found his cave after hours of searching, a small opening hidden by a thick curtain of brush. They called out, and a gruff voice from inside told them to get lost. "We need your help, Mr. Davies," Abigail called out, her voice filled with a desperate plea. "It's about Sheriff Blackwood." A moment of silence, then the gruff voice again. "I ain't got no business with that man. Leave me be." Elizabeth stepped forward. "I am Elizabeth Stanton," she said, her voice carrying a regal authority. "The sheriff's bride, and I have just exposed him as a thief and a fraud. He has stolen a man's land, and he is coming for us. We need a witness. We need someone the townsfolk can trust, someone who isn't afraid of him." The curtain of brush was pushed aside, and Old Man Davies emerged. His eyes, surprisingly clear, swept over them. He looked from the elegant, albeit disheveled woman in the riding habit to the young, exhausted girl beside her. He took a long, appraising look. "You're Silas's woman," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You got guts, lady, and you, girl, you're the Abernathy's girl. I heard about what happened. You're a fool, both of you. You can't fight a king in his own castle. We're not asking you to fight, Elizabeth said, her voice firm. We're asking you to tell the truth, to stand with us. You know Blackwood's been doing this for years. He's been pushing out the smaller ranchers, taking their land for himself. We have proof, Mr. Davies. A ledger entry. We can end his reign of terror. Old Man Davies looked at her, then at Abigail, and a slow, thoughtful expression spread across his weathered face. He sat on a rock, taking a long pull from a canteen. He was considering it. He was a man of the hills, a man who lived by his own code, and one of his codes was a deep respect for a fair fight. You're fighting for a man you've never met, he said, his eyes on Abigail. And you, he said, turning to Elizabeth, you're fighting against a man who holds your life in his hands. You're both fools, the townsfolk. They're cowards. They'll fold the moment Blackwood threatens them. He's got them by the neck. Maybe, Abigail said, her voice quiet but firm. But he can't have them all. He can't buy you, Mr. Davies. You have nothing to be afraid of. Old Man Davies looked at the two women, a fierce, unlikely pair. He saw their conviction, their courage. He saw a glimmer of his own defiant spirit in their eyes. He spat a stream of tobacco juice on the ground. You're right, he said, a slow grin spreading across his face. I ain't got nothing to lose. I'll help you. But you listen to me. This ain't gonna be easy. When you face Silas Blackwood, you're facing a cornered rattlesnake. He'll strike without warning, and he won't stop until you're dead. We'll need a bigger plan. He had a plan, a long-held grudge against the sheriff that had been simmering for years. A knowledge of the land, of the people, of Blackwood's dark secrets. He wasn't a hero, but he was a key. And with his agreement, the fight for redemption had just found a new, powerful and very dangerous ally. Old Man Davies was a relic of a different time, a man who saw the world in simple terms, good ore and bad ore, honest labor and crooked deals. Silas Blackwood, in his eyes, was the latter. The sheriff was a vein of bad ore running through redemption, and Davies was ready to start digging. He led Elizabeth and Abigail to a hidden part of the canyon, a place where the sun was always a little less bright, and the wind carried a chill. He's been doing this for years, Davies rasped, his voice like gravel. He ain't just after the Abernathy land. He's been forcing out ranchers, miners and settlers all over the county, but he's not doing it alone. The town's been on his payroll, a few of the upstanding citizens. He gives them a cut and they keep their mouths shut. Abigail's eyes widened. She had always suspected Blackwood was a thief, but a full-blown conspiracy was a different matter. Who? She asked. The saloon owner, Jed. He keeps the men quiet. The blacksmith, his brother, owes Silas a lot of money. The banker. Well, you already figured that out, Davies said, a knowing look in his eye. They all think they're safe because they're in on it, but Silas is a snake. Once he's got what he wants, he'll turn on them. He always does. Elizabeth listened intently, her mind working like a finely tuned machine. We need to turn them against him, she said. We need to show them that they are not partners but puppets. We need to expose their role in his crimes, not just to the town, but to each other. We need to create chaos. When a man feels cornered, he will turn on his own kind. Davies grinned, a rare sight that exposed his yellowed teeth. Now that's a plan, but how do you do that from a hole in the ground? Elizabeth pulled out a few sheets of paper and a small bottle of ink from her satchel. We'll write letters, anonymous letters to each of them. We'll expose their deals, their secrets and their betrayals. We will tell the blacksmith that the saloon owner is selling him out. We will tell the saloon owner that the banker is planning to cut him out of the deals. We'll sow seeds of doubt and paranoia. They'll start to question each other. They'll stop trusting Blackwood. Abigail was a natural at writing, a skill she had learned from a traveling schoolteacher years ago. She began to write, her pen scratching furiously on the paper. The letters were carefully crafted, each one tailored to a specific person's fears and insecurities. The tone was persuasive and conspiratorial, a voice of a phantom ally who was on their side, watching Blackwood, and who knew everything. They sealed the letters with a bit of wax from a candle they had and gave them to Davies. "You'll get these to them. Leave them in places they won't be seen. The back of the saloon, the blacksmith's forge, the bank counter. The moment they read these, the whole house of cards will come down." Davies took the letters, his gnarled hands a stark contrast to the delicate paper. "Don't you worry, Missy. I'll make sure these fall into the right hands." "But what about Blackwood?" "He's already a cornered animal," Elizabeth said, her eyes gleaming with a fierce satisfaction. "He's lost his authority, his reputation, and his bride. Now he's a man with nothing left to lose. He's coming for us. So we wait, we prepare, we let the paranoia eat away at his men. And when he's at his most vulnerable, we strike." The plan was a dangerous one, a fragile alliance built on a shared desire for vengeance. But it was their only chance. Blackwood was a beast of a man, and his rage was a hurricane. They couldn't fight him head-on. They had to be smarter, faster, and more ruthless, and they had a secret weapon that he didn't know about, their own resilience, their story of betrayal and courage. It was a story that could turn the tide of redemption, one that could set them all free. The letters, delivered under the cloak of night by Old Man Davies, hit their targets like a poison. The morning in redemption was different. The air, usually filled with the monotonous sounds of work, was thick with suspicion. The men who had been in Blackwood's inner circle were no longer a cohesive group. They eyed each other with a new distrust. The blacksmith, a hulking man named Thomas, found a note tucked into his forge. It spoke of his debts, of the sheriff's plan to seize his land after the town was cleaned out, and it named Jed, the saloon owner, as a snitch who was telling Silas that Thomas was a liability. At the saloon, Jed found a similar letter tucked under a bottle of whiskey. It spoke of the bank's plan to cut him out of a new lucrative deal. It mentioned the banker, Bartholomew, and Blackwood's private disdain for him. The carefully worded words sowed doubt where there had been none. It was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. The chaos began slowly, a quiet undercurrent of paranoia that rippled through the town. At the saloon, the men who had been Blackwood's loyalists sat at separate tables. Their usual friendly banter was replaced by tense silence. Jed, his face a mask of suspicion, watched his men with a new wariness. The blacksmith, Thomas, was less talkative than usual, his brow furrowed in thought as he worked. He kept glancing at Jed, a flicker of anger in his eyes. Silas Blackwood, meanwhile, was oblivious. He was too consumed by his hunt for Elizabeth and Abigail. He had a few of his men riding out, searching the surrounding area for any sign of them. He was a man possessed, his rage a consuming fire. He rode back into town, his horse lathered with foam. He found the town quiet, too quiet. The usual murmur of the town was replaced by a tense silence. He saw the look on the faces of his men, a look of suspicion and fear. "What's wrong with you people?" he roared, his voice a gravelly echo in the street. "Why aren't you talking? Why are you acting like a bunch of rattled rabbits?" Jed, the saloon owner, stepped out of his saloon, a cold look in his eyes. "We're just a little spooked, Sheriff," he said, his voice flat. "We heard some things, rumors. Things about how you're going to be a lone wolf once you get what you want." Blackwood's eyes narrowed. "Rumors? What rumors?" "Rumors about us," Jed said, gesturing to the men in the street. "About how we're just your pawns, and how you're going to cut us out once the dust settles. I don't like the sound of that, Silas. We were partners." Blackwood's rage was a physical presence. He was losing control. The men he had so carefully cultivated, the men who had been his enforcers, were turning on him. He saw the doubt in their eyes, the fear of betrayal that was greater than their fear of him. He looked at Thomas, the blacksmith, and saw a cold, hard look of anger in his eyes. "Thomas," Blackwood said, his voice a low growl, "you got something to say." "I don't like being a pawn, Sheriff," Thomas said, his voice a powerful rumble. "I've done a lot for you. I've kept my mouth shut. And now I hear you're going to take my brother's debt and my land. I don't think so, Silas." Blackwood's mind reeled. This was a direct attack on his power, his reputation. He knew Elizabeth and Abigail were behind it. They were using his own tactics against him. They were planting seeds of doubt, a poison that would destroy his support from the inside out. He had to stop it. He had to reassert his dominance. He pulled his gun, the cold steel a sudden point of light in the dusty street. "You're all a bunch of cowards," he said, his voice filled with a desperate fury. "You're listening to a hysterical woman and a common girl. I am your sheriff. I am your law, and I am telling you, there is no conspiracy. There is no betrayal. I am a man of my word. We are partners." But his words fell on deaf ears. They saw the desperation in his eyes, the naked fear. He was not a king. He was a tyrant. The men who'd been cowed for so long felt a shift in the air. Their fear was now mixed with a new, emboldening sense of defiance. They had lost their blind trust in him, and they saw a path to freedom. Jed, the saloon owner, took a step forward. "You can go on and call us cowards, Sheriff," he said, his voice clear and firm. "But a king who has no one to serve him is just a man with a crown. And you, Silas, you're not a king. You're just a thief, and we are not your servants anymore." The men began to scatter, leaving Blackwood standing alone in the street. His kingdom, built on a foundation of fear and greed, was crumbling. The seed of doubt, planted by Elizabeth and Abigail, had taken root, and it had grown into a tree of rebellion. The real battle for redemption was just beginning. Silas Blackwood was a wounded beast. His empire, built on a foundation of fear and coercion, was crumbling. The men who had been his loyalists had turned on him, their fear of betrayal now greater than their fear of him. He was a king without a kingdom, a sheriff without a posse. He had only one thing left, his rage, and he knew exactly where to direct it. He grabbed his horse, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. He would find Elizabeth and Abigail, and he would make them pay for every single one of his humiliations. He had a feeling he knew where they were. He had a few old trails and watering holes he knew of, places where a fugitive could hide. He rode for hours, his mind a single-minded torrent of vengeance. He would make an example of them. He would show the town of Redemption what happened to those who dared to cross him. Meanwhile, back in the canyon, Old Man Davies, Elizabeth, and Abigail were preparing for the final showdown. Davies, with his deep knowledge of the land, had set up a few booby traps. He had a few old snares he had repurposed, ropes tied to trees, and a few cleverly hidden holes. He was a wily old prospector, and his mind was a weapon in its own right. "He's a man of habit," Davies said, his eyes scanning the horizon. "He'll take the old trail. He's too angry to think clearly. His rage will be his undoing." Elizabeth and Abigail were ready. They had a small supply of water and food. They had a single rifle that Davies had given them, a rusty old thing that was more for show than for fighting. They knew their real weapons were their wits and their courage. They were two women against a man with a gun. The odds were against them, but they had something he didn't, a cause. They waited. The sun began to set, painting the sky in a blaze of orange and red. The air grew cold, and the silence was a heavy, expectant presence. Then they heard it. The familiar thunder of a horse's hooves, a single rider. It was him. Silas Blackwood, his face a grim mask, rode into the canyon. He was alone. He was too proud to ask for help from the men who had betrayed him. He was a man who wanted to settle a score, a one-on-one battle. He dismounted, his boots crunching on the loose gravel. "Elizabeth! Abigail!" he roared, his voice an echo in the canyon. "Come out and face me! You've had your fun. Now it's time to pay the price." A sudden sound, a click of a rifle, made him freeze. He looked up and he saw them, Elizabeth and Abigail, a silhouette against the fading light, standing on a ledge above him. Old Man Davies was a shadow behind them. "We're not a joke, Silas," Elizabeth said, her voice clear and steady. "We're not your pawns. We're not your property. We are people, and we are here to hold you accountable." Blackwood laughed. a harsh, humorless sound. "You think that old rust bucket can stop me?" he said, gesturing to the rifle in Abigail's hand. "I'm a sheriff. I have the law on my side. I have a dozen men who would die for me." "They've all turned on you, Silas," Abigail said, her voice filled with a new, quiet confidence. "They know the truth. They know you're a fraud. You have nothing left." Blackwood's face contorted in a furious rage. He pulled his gun. "I have this," he roared, "and it's all I need to shut you both up for good." He took a step forward, and his foot caught on a tripwire. A net, cleverly hidden in the brush, flew up and wrapped around him. He fell, a loud thud echoing in the canyon. He thrashed, trying to free himself, but the net, a contraption of old rope and sinew, held him fast. He was a cornered rattlesnake, a man stripped of his power and his dignity. "You're pathetic, Silas," Elizabeth said, her voice filled with a cold contempt. "You are nothing without your gun, nothing without your men, nothing without your pride." Abigail, her hands trembling, stepped forward and took the deed from her pocket, the one she had copied from the bank ledger. "I have the proof, Silas," she said, her voice strong. "The Abernathy land is not yours. It never was. I'm going to take this back to town. I'm going to show the townsfolk what a real man looks like, a man who fights for what's right, not what's easy." Blackwood, trapped in the net, looked at them, his eyes wide with a desperate, animalistic rage. He was a monster who had been stripped of his skin, a fraud exposed. He was a man who had lost everything, his kingdom, his pride, his power. It was over. The journey back to redemption was a slow and deliberate one. The sun was rising, casting a golden light over the dusty prairie. Abigail and Elizabeth rode the horse, their faces smudged with dirt and exhaustion, but their eyes filled with a new sense of purpose. Old Man Davies, a silent shadow, walked beside them, a testament to his newfound alliance. They were no longer fugitives. They were harbingers of change. They had a plan, a simple one, but one that was now a powerful weapon. They would return to town, and they would tell the truth. They would show the townsfolk the proof, and they would let them decide. They were not afraid anymore. As they rode into town, the townsfolk who had been huddled in their homes emerged cautiously. They saw the two women, no longer the sheriff's bride and the common girl, but two figures of strength and defiance. They saw the old prospector, a man they respected for his honesty, walking beside them. They saw the deed in Abigail's hand, a symbol of hope. Elizabeth stood in the town square, the same place where she had humiliated Blackwood. She held the deed up high for everyone to see. Her voice, clear and strong, echoed in the quiet street. "People of redemption," she said, "the sheriff is not in town. He has been detained, and I have something to show you, something that proves he has been lying to you all. He has been taking your land, your money, and your freedom. He has been preying on your fear, but now that fear is gone, you are free." Abigail stepped forward, her hands trembling as she held out the deed. The townsfolk, hesitant at first, slowly gathered around. They saw the document, the proof of Blackwood's treachery. The names of their friends, their neighbors, and even their families were on the list of victims. Their fear was replaced by a slow-burning rage. A few men, the ones who had been in Blackwood's inner circle, looked on with a mix of shame and relief. They had been exposed, but they were also free. The chain of complicity had been broken. They were no longer the sheriff's men. They were their own men. Abigail then told her story, her voice filled with a raw honesty that moved the townsfolk. She spoke of her promise to Caleb, of her love for old Mr. Abernathy, and of her struggle against a powerful man who wanted to take it all. She spoke of her desperate plea to Elizabeth, the sheriff's bride, and of the unlikely alliance that had formed between them. She spoke of their journey, their fear, and their courage. Her words were a mirror, reflecting the truth of their own lives. They had all been victims of Blackwood's greed. They had all been too scared to fight back. But now they saw a path to redemption, A man from the back of the crowd, a farmer whose land had been taken by Blackwood a few years ago, stepped forward. His eyes, filled with tears, met Abigail's. "Is it true?" he asked. Is he gone?" "He's in a canyon, tied up in a net," Old Man Davies said, a wry grin on his face. "He's not a sheriff anymore. He's just a man who got what he deserved." A cheer, small and tentative at first, erupted in the square. It grew, a wave of noise, a sound of relief and hope that had been suppressed for so long. The men who had been Blackwood's pawns, the ones who had betrayed him, looked at each other and felt a sense of camaraderie. They were all in the same boat now, a boat of shared shame and a shared victory. The old order was gone, and a new one was about to begin. The news spread like wildfire. The sheriff was gone. The townsfolk who had lived in the shadow of fear for so long felt a new sense of freedom. They organized a small party, a celebration of their newfound liberty. The saloon was filled with a boisterous crowd, the beer flowing freely. The townsfolk, who had been so suspicious of each other, were now a united front. Elizabeth, however, did not attend. She was a woman of St. Louis, and she knew she had a new path. Her business in redemption was done. She had found her freedom, and she had given it to the town. She had a new purpose now, a new mission. She would go back to St. Louis, to her father's bank, and she would find Thomas Thorne. She would expose him. She had learned how to fight fire with fire, and she would use that lesson to avenge her father's death. Abigail, however, stayed. She was a part of redemption. She was the one who had set the town free, and she was the one who would help it rebuild. She was no longer a common girl. She was a hero. The townsfolk looked at her with a new respect. They saw her as a leader, a woman of courage and integrity. They offered her a home, a job, and a place in their community. She had found her family. She and Elizabeth shared a final emotional goodbye. They stood on the porch of the Abernathy cabin, the setting sun painting the sky in a blaze of color. "You're a brave woman, Abigail," Elizabeth said, her eyes filled with a profound sadness and a profound admiration. "You have a home here, a family, and a cause. You'll do great things." "And you, Elizabeth," Abigail said, her voice filled with a new, firm resolve. "You have your own fight to fight. You'll win. You're a lot stronger than you look." Elizabeth laughed, a short, sad sound. "I am. I learned that from you. You showed me that courage isn't about being unafraid. It's about being terrified and doing it anyway. Thank you, Abigail, for everything." She embraced Abigail, a quick, firm hug, and then she mounted her horse. She rode out of redemption, a lone rider, a woman on a mission. She had left her old life behind, and she was heading toward a new one, a life of vengeance and justice. Abigail stood there for a long time, watching the dust cloud that Elizabeth's horse had kicked up. She thought of her, a woman who had been a cold, distant stranger, who had turned into a friend, a confidant, and an ally. She was a hero in her own right, a woman who had found her purpose in the most unlikely of places. She looked around. The town was quiet. The sun had set and the stars were beginning to appear, a blanket of white dots against the dark sky. She was no longer a common girl. She was a woman of redemption. She had a home, a purpose, and a family. The town was her family now. She was ready to start a new chapter, a chapter of a new life, of a new town, of a new dawn. The story had a happy ending, but it was just the beginning. The story of redemption was just beginning. The story of a brave orphan girl and a proud scoundrel of a bride who had changed the course of history. The sun sets on redemption, but the town is now filled with a different kind of light, the light of hope, of justice, of a community that has found its voice. The townsfolk, once a fearful and fractured group, are now a united front. They have chosen a new leader, a man of integrity and honesty. They have chosen to rebuild, not on a foundation of fear, but on a foundation of courage and community. The Abernathy land, once the source of a great injustice, is now a symbol of their victory. Abigail, once a simple caretaker, is now a pillar of the community. She has a new job, a new life, and a new purpose. She has found her family in the town of redemption, and she has found her home in the place she had fought so hard to protect. She is no longer just a girl. She is a legend, a symbol of what is possible when a single person decides to stand up for what is right. Elizabeth, a lone rider on a new mission, is a woman of purpose. She has shed her old name, her old life, and her old fears. She is no longer just a bride. She is a woman on a mission of vengeance and justice. She has found her voice, her strength, and her courage, and she is ready to face the world. She has a long road ahead of her, a road filled with dangers and challenges, but she is no longer afraid. She has a new kind of power, a power that comes from a deep, unwavering sense of justice. The story of redemption is not a story of a magical world or of a supernatural hero. It is a story of a real human drama. It is a story of a man who ruled by fear and was brought down by the courage of two women. It is a story of a town that was a kingdom of fear and was turned into a home of hope. It is a story of two women who, in a moment of a shared injustice, found a new kind of freedom. The sun sets on redemption, the dust settles, the wind, a constant dusty presence, is still there, but it carries a new sound now, a sound of hope, a sound of a new dawn. The story ends, but the journey of the characters continues. The lessons they have learned, the battles they have fought, the victories they have won will stay with them forever. They are no longer just characters in a story. They are legends. They are symbols. They are heroes.